Hello and welcome to Season 2 of the Life at Leyton podcast with me, Sarah Glanville, as your host. Here at Leyton UK, we know our people are more than just their job. The careers of our people are part of their unique lives, and who they are as a whole person is what fundamentally contributes to their success and the success of our business. In the podcast, we'll spend time with one of our exceptional people from across the business. And in each episode, we'll look to explore the people behind the job titles, the unique and brilliant stories that make them who they are. It's June 2024, and we are celebrating and educating during Pride Month here at Leyton UK. Today's episode is a very special one. We welcome Katie Swan onto the podcast to talk about what Pride means to her, as well as a deep conversation about navigating identity and learning to accept and celebrate yourself for you. Thank you so much, Katie, for sharing your story, particularly on a topic that can be vast and challenging. I'm sure that everyone is going to get so much from this episode. And thank you all for tuning in. Grab yourself a coffee and get ready to be inspired by the people that are Leyton UK. Hello, Katie. Welcome to the Life at Leyton podcast. How are you?
Good, thank you. How are you?
I am really good, thank you. Thank you for being here to do our celebratory Pride episode for 2024. Really excited to have you on the podcast and to talk about something that you're really passionate about.
Yeah, no, delighted. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So I guess the best place for us to start today is to talk a little bit about what Pride means to you personally, and I guess if you could give us a bit of insight on what you feel it means to the broader LGBTQIA+ community.
Yeah, I think Pride means different things for everyone, and that's why it's such a great celebration that happens every year. For me personally, kind of what I refer to when I talk about Pride for myself, it's just kind of knowing who you are and kind of living within that truth, whether that's personally, like you're not out to anyone, or more loudly, obviously depends on the individual. I don't think you need to be out to have pride, and you certainly don't need to evidence your identity to anyone to have pride. But for me personally, when I think about pride, it's really about, thinking about the fact that the only person that needs to understand my identity is myself. And it's obviously with immense privilege that I can say that. Obviously, there's cultural and societal expectations that can hinder other people's journeys. But for me, pride really is just about, I guess, accepting myself and not seeking validation from anybody but me. Maybe a bit selfish of a way to look at it. But yeah, that's what I think of when I think about pride.
I really like that. I love that answer, because I think you do often think about pride being about almost talking about it loudly and being very proud openly to everyone. But I guess that always really does start with how you feel within yourself and sort of recognizing that within yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, you don't need to be out to be proud of who you are. There's many people who live their lives quietly, the same way there's many people who live their lives loudly. And I just think so long as you can feel that comfortability in yourself, I think that's, for me, where pride at least begins or rests. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Before we jump into the next question, Katie, I think it's probably a good point to just sort of signpost through the episode. We're going to use this as an opportunity to educate on some terms that are probably well known or known within the community, but maybe on a broader scale, people don't feel quite comfortable understanding what the words mean. So I'll ask this next question. I'll give a little bit of a explanation at the end of it. So how do you navigate and affirm your identity in a world that often imposes binary standards on sexuality and gender? So that's the idea that people are either exclusively gay or straight, male or female.
Yeah, personally, I've kind of stopped trying to affirm my identity to people. But for bisexuality in particular, the part that I do like to affirm or correct people on, which I think is a really important part of bisexuality, is that there's this idea that to be bisexual, it means you have a 50-50 split in terms of the genders that you're attracted to. And what that does is it erases a whole other horde of identities. So people aren't just cisgender male, i.e. they are born and identify with the gender assigned to them at birth, or cisgender female. There's a range of genders the same way there's a range of sexualities, and bisexuality is actually the attraction to two or more genders, and they don't need to just be cisgender men and cisgender women. There are bisexual people who prefer to only date non-binary individuals and transgender individuals, people who prefer cisgendered women and transgender women, people who prefer multiple genders. There's no specific binary guideline that because you're bisexual, it must be two genders that you're attracted to, and they must be male and female. I think that misconception really comes from the idea, because it's bisexual. Bi literally means two, which then translates to two gender attraction. However, I think it's a bit too specific or too literal of a way to look at it. For example, September, sept means 7. September is not the 7th month. So why are we taking that so literally? So, you can, within bisexuality, you can be attracted to a range of genders, multiple genders. And as well, you don't need to have dated every gender that you're attracted to be bisexual. You can have only dated one gender and still be bisexual, the same way you can date 3 different genders and still be bisexual. So I think people like to categorize things and put labels on things, and if you say it's bisexual, that means it's 2, and it means it's 50-50, but that's actually just not the way it works. It's a spectrum, the same way a lot of sexualities and genders are.
That's really interesting. I think potentially, and I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on this as well. Do you think there's a lack of understanding of what it actually means, and it's just a preconceived idea that there are only 2 genders? Maybe people believe that, or they don't have a understanding or haven't asked questions, and they kind of come into it almost thinking they know and haven't found themselves asking the question to the right person before to be educated.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, even personally, in my journey to understanding my identity, I had to do a lot of research. I grew up thinking exactly what I just negated, being that it has to be 50-50. You have to date both consistently. You have to meet some sort of quota to be seen as queer enough to fall into this category. But that's just not the case. I think people like to impose these standards because they don't understand. And it's an education piece, and that can be quite exhausting to have to keep reaffirming to people, which is, like I said, I kind of have to just stop doing it now, and it's really about what I know about myself. But
I think it is that balance between, you don't have to justify who you are to anyone, you don't have to talk to anyone about it, and it's, I guess, finding the balance for people who aren't part of the community or don't feel they know enough about the community to do their own research and, to be curious, but to be respectful of people's boundaries as well.
Yeah, exactly. You don't owe your identity to anyone. You don't have to explain it to anybody. But if you don't understand something, that doesn't mean it's not real to that person, to other people. So yeah, it's about educating yourself. It's having an open mind, and I think we're hopefully moving towards a society that is a bit more accepting. I don't know, we're still quite a long way off, but there are more and more of these things are being recognized, that there are more than one gender, or that there is more than 2 genders, excuse me, that there are a myriad of sexualities that people can identify with, as well as genders. So yeah, hopefully we're moving towards somewhere where people are just more open-minded to the concept that things aren't just binary. You can be attracted to who you're attracted to, and that's fine so long as it's consensual. Yeah, I think that's would be my thoughts on that, I think.
No, that's great. That leads us really nicely on to our next question, which is, can you share your thoughts on the concept of coming out to yourself first, and why it's such a crucial step in the journey of self-acceptance?
Yeah, that's actually a term that I read somewhere. I don't remember where, but it was said that the first step is coming out to yourself. And honestly, that's as big a step as many of the others. And, I can only really talk about it from my point of view. But I knew I was bisexual since I was probably 14 or 15, but I just didn't tell anyone. I thought it was maybe I just really liked how that girl looked. Maybe I just wanted to look more like her. And, spoiler alert, that wasn't what it was. But the first time I did tell somebody, it was at a sleepover with a friend of mine, truth or dare, as we do. And I said I had like a crush on a girl in school. And then the next morning, my friend was leaving, and I literally shouted after her as she went outside, like, that was only a joke. It wasn't real. But I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to be out to her. And I actually think I just wasn't ready to be out to myself. I didn't understand it enough. And it wasn't until I was 18 and I had kind of done more research, talked to more people, really sat with it and thought about what it meant, that I finally accepted it. And even after that, it was years later when I really understood what it meant for me. And when I actually came out, it was in my late 20s, way after 15, 16 years after I had that first idea. And hopefully it doesn't take that long for everyone else, but it's that idea of understanding it first and being comfortable in saying it yourself, I think is a really, really important first step.
Absolutely. And I think we're always all on a journey of like learning about ourselves and understanding ourselves better. And that's in every facet of our lives.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like you said, we're always on a journey. We're always learning about ourselves. I think, you're never going to stop learning new things about yourself so long as you're having new experiences. So yeah, for sure. I think it's tied in with that. But, every person's journey is different. Some people realize straight away what they're into. Some people, it takes a long time. You hear of bisexual people who've been married for 40 years to a gender and then come out as bisexual. And that doesn't mean that they're not bisexual because they've only been with one gender and will only be with that one gender. You never stop learning things about yourself. But for me, I think, yeah, that moment of knowing who you are and being comfortable in understanding that what it means for yourself is the first step in that self-acceptance, like you said.
Great. And what's your experience been with bi-erasure? So the tendency to ignore, remove, falsify, or re-explain evidence of bisexuality. That's both within the LGBTQIA+ community and from the outside. And how do you address it? It's quite a big question, so we can break it down if you want.
Yeah. How long do we have, Sarah? But yeah, I mean, bi erasure, every single bisexual I've ever met and talked to has dealt with it, including myself. So like you said, it's basically the erasure of the bisexual identity, and it can be on a scale from bisexuality just doesn't exist to, oh, you're gay because you're with this gender, or you're straight because you're with this gender, or you haven't actually dated someone of the same gender, so how do you know you're bisexual? That last one always kind of makes me laugh, because I'm like, people know who they're attracted to generally before they date them. I don't know any straight person who's had to date somebody to realize they were straight, so I don't know why that applies elsewhere. And to be honest, like, a lot of those comments are really what kept me from kind of telling people for a long time. But yeah, I mean, it's a frustrating experience, and sadly it's something that's rampant both in and out of the LGBTQIA community. I mean, within the community, there's this idea that, because a bisexual person can, quote unquote, choose to be with a person of the opposite sex, that is assuming that they are cisgendered and attracted to other cisgendered individuals, that they're not queer enough because they can choose, or that bisexuals negate the idea that queer people are, born that way, because you can almost opt out, for want of a better term. And obviously that's a massive misconception, because it's not a choice. You are attracted to who you're attracted to. In terms of how I react to it and deal with it, it kind of ranges day to day, but for the most part, now that I'm very comfortable in knowing who I am, I kind of ignore it a lot of the time. That's not to say I haven't gotten into some heated debates and arguments with people in my life, because I absolutely have. But at this stage, as I've kind of mentioned before, I've really just arrived at the conclusion that I don't owe anybody any information or proof, and I know who I am, and really that's what matters to me.
Yeah, I think it's such a hard, and it's commendable that you've got to that place now where you can kind of step back and say, like, I don't need to get engaged in these conversations, because it's hard when it's very personal, isn't it? And you feel almost like you need to defend yourself and answer questions when people have them. So I'm glad you've
Mhm.
got to a place now where you feel like you don't need to get sucked into that, but I can understand why it's so difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say that I don't still sometimes get stuck into the arguments. I definitely, a couple of weeks ago, had one. But for the most part, I just, why am I going to bother trying to explain myself, and why do I have to explain myself to somebody? Once I know and I feel comfortable and everything's consensual, like I said, then that's all that matters at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Okay, so could you explain the difference between less binary sexualities, such as bisexuality, so the
Mhm.
attraction to more than one gender,
Yeah.
pansexuality, and asexuality? I don't know if you want to give a bit of a definition as well for the different sexualities there, and also the
Yeah.
distinction between romantic and sexual attraction.
Yes. I mean, I think there's so much to unpack within all of that. So I'll definitely do my best. But I think the biggest conversation out of the different sexualities that we mentioned there, the biggest kind of discussion that you'll see is probably between the difference between pansexuality and bisexuality. And, some people do use those terms interchangeably. But the difference between the two really comes down to the importance of gender, or the person's gender or their sex, to your attraction. So generally, pansexuality refers to being kind of gender blind, is a term you might see. So that is, you are attracted to somebody regardless of their gender. Whereas with bisexuality, gender generally tends to be a bit more of a component. As mentioned earlier, bisexuality can mean that you are attracted to all genders, some genders, two genders. It's a spectrum. But generally within bisexuality, the gender or the sex of the person is still a component of why you are attracted to them. Whereas for pansexuality, it isn't necessarily a factor, or at least it's not a primary factor. So that would be kind of the main differences between those two. It was asexuality, yeah. So asexuality is also a spectrum, and I feel like I've used that word to death in this so far. But at its core, asexuality is about having a lack of sexual attraction. So to kind of go on to your next part of that question, I think it's probably important to understand the difference between sexual attraction and romantic attraction, because they aren't actually the same thing, and they're not necessarily linked. So you can be romantically attracted to somebody but not sexually attracted to somebody, and vice versa. You don't have to be romantically attracted to everyone that you're sexually attracted to, and you can never experience romantic attraction and you can never experience sexual attraction, and you can never experience both. So you can be not sexually or romantically attracted to anybody, and that would be aromantic and asexual, or aro-ace is the term that you probably hear in the community. So yeah, asexuality, again, a banner sexuality. There's a myriad of identities under that, way too many to get into now. But I think that's why it's quite a misunderstood identity. Again, people like to understand things, and people who feel those sorts of attractions can't really understand how somebody doesn't. But that, yeah, generally is what asexuality refers to.
Well, that's great. I think that's such a like information overload almost. Of it's really
Sorry.
is no, it's so good because it's these conversations that I think stimulate people beginning to think and understand when it's
Mhm.
something, as you said, that's it's hard to understand when it's not
Yeah.
your experience. So
Mhm.
thank you for going through that and trying to explain that, and hopefully people will get a lot from that answer. Um, my final question for you is how you handle the frustration of feeling the need to explain your sexuality. And I know we spoke a little bit about you feeling now that you don't have to, or you don't want to have to all the time. But how have you handled that frustration in the past? And what message do you have for others about embracing their authentic selves despite societal expectations?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned there, at this stage of my life, I don't bother trying to explain it, but definitely previously there was a lot of frustration, um, and a lot of things that makes you question yourself as well. Um, you know, well, maybe I'm not, maybe I'm just overthinking it. Maybe I'm actually this, or maybe I'm actually that. But I think, my message for people who are looking to embrace their authentic selves would be just to remember, as I've mentioned a few times, you don't owe your sexuality or your identity, your gender, whatever it is, to anybody. You don't need to validate your identity. There's no test. You don't need to meet a quota. If you know who you are, then that's what matters. That being said, I think it's also important to remember that labels don't make or break who you are attracted to. There are people who never label their sexuality and never label their gender. There's people who are still searching for their label, as well as many people who currently identify one way, but then realize that maybe actually that didn't particularly suit them. If you put a label on yourself, it doesn't have to be the one that you stick with for the rest of your life. I know people who identified as bisexual and then realized they were pansexual, and people who identified as gay and realized actually they were bisexual. Again, it's all fluid. As human beings, we have this innate need to understand and give names to things, and that's not always the most helpful approach, especially for people who are still questioning and still understanding who they are, in a world that likes to impose those standards. So yeah, I guess from all that, my message would be authentic to yourself. And I think that's my key message for people to take away. Again, I've said this about 500 times now, but you don't owe anyone any explanations or reasonings or, your CV of your dating history. That's all personal to you. If you feel comfortable in who you are, then that's the first step forward.
I love that. And I think that's really important for people to take away. So thank you so much, Katie. Thank you for being so honest and open and talking about this topic that I guess can be a little bit challenging to navigate. So I appreciate your willingness to jump on the podcast and talk openly.
No, of course. Pride is coming up. It's my favorite time of the year. I'm very excited to volunteer at the parade again. I had the most fun doing it before. So yeah, happy to do this as well.
Yeah. So just before we jump off then, tell us a little bit about the Pride Parade in London. Yeah, that's the one that you're going to be volunteering at.
Yeah. Oh gosh, it's so much fun. So I volunteer on the parade route, both because I want to volunteer and also because you get the best view of the parade because you're literally on it. But yeah, it's just such a fun day. And I had only been to Pride in Dublin 2015 maybe was the last time, and it was well before I was really out to anybody, and it was a very different experience than going last year, and just being able to, I had my bi flag and dancing with people and celebrating with people. I met a really, really good friend of mine now at the parade as well. So yeah, it's just a thrilling place to be, whether you're in the closet, whether you're an ally, whether you're out and proud, whatever it is. It's just such a day of celebration and love and harmony. And I feel really cheesy now, but I've never been in an atmosphere like it. Yeah, I'm very excited.
So inclusive, and yes, somewhere you can just be yourself. And you obviously mentioned allies are welcome to go as well. So yeah.
Allyship is so important, especially for people who don't feel particularly safe yet. Just knowing that there's somebody there who's going to support them and defend them. And I'm not saying need to leap in front and defend them, but someone that you can say is a safe person. Allyship is so important. There's an ally flag that people can get. But Pride everyone is welcome at Pride, obviously, if they're there to celebrate Pride. But yeah, it's great.
Yeah, I'm very jealous. I think you're going to have a great time in London. I think I'm definitely going to see when the one in Edinburgh and Glasgow are, and see if I can make it along. It does look like the best day.
Oh, so much fun. And there's just I actually learned so much just being there, because again, you can't know everything. I don't know anything. Everything, what I just spoke through is from my own experiences, my own research. I can't speak for everybody within the community. But even just going there and talking to people and seeing the different groups going through the parade, the different flags that I'd never experienced before, it really opens up your eyes. And I think just to experience that queer joy is so important as well to people within the community. I'm going to wax lyrical about it all day, but Go to your local Pride. It's so fun.
Great. No, I think we'll end things there. Katie, thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to chat about before I wrap up?
No, I think that's it for me. Yeah, thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. All right, thank you, Katie, and thank you to everyone for listening along at home. I hope that you all enjoyed that chat as much as I did. So we're going to be back in a few weeks' time with our final episode of this financial year. But until then, if you're one of the members in our talent community and you're interested in finding out more about what the future might look like at Leyton, please do reach out to one of us here in the talent acquisition team. I'll put my contact details in the description below, or check out the careers page for any of the roles that we have live currently. We'll be back in a few weeks. Thanks again, Katie, for sharing your story. Thank you all for listening in. This has been the Life at Leyton podcast.